I think we've got a really interesting panel. Rather than me telling you about who they are, I'm going to let them tell you themselves. Alex, shall I start with you?
Yep, sure. Hi, I'm Alex Noto. I'm the Director of Product and Service Innovation at Places for People Group. PFP, if you know it at all, is a large housing association that's evolved now into actually being a very diversified propco. We've got 28 companies within the group, with everything from construction through to fund management, property management, and everything in between. We have 192,000 units under management across the group, across the UK. 65,000 of those are traditional social housing, which is the core of the business. But actually, we're continuing to grow and evolve our PRS and our build-to-rent offer.
And Olivia.
So I'm Olivia Harris, the Chief Executive at Dolphin Living. Dolphin Living are an affordable housing provider, charity, providing sub-market build-to-rent in and around Westminster. Unlike most build-to-rent providers... Sorry, can you hear me? It seems to be cutting in and out a bit. Our focus is on providing as much sub-market rent as we possibly can. We have a focus on being tenure blind within our buildings where there is some market rent housing, and focus on design, making the buildings as livable as possible.
And Russell.
I'm Russell Pedley from Sale Architecture. We also have interior design and external design and urban design. So design is really what we're about. Mostly residentially led, mixed-use developments in urban, suburban and some rural locations. And that's really our passion.
Okay, good. So I think we've got plenty of experience here to talk about today. Now, Russell, I'm going to invite you you've got some slides to talk to.
Just a few.
You have 10 minutes. Russell has over 100 slides. And Alex has bet Russell that if he doesn't do it in 10 minutes, he's got to buy her a bottle of champagne. So Gareth Blacker, will you be on time?
The other way
round,
please?
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Or vice versa. So you've got 10 minutes and the time starts now.
Oh, that's a good start. Right. Okay, so talking about creating neighbourhoods and communities, and what I thought I'd do is share with you some of the aspects that we put into our designs and the process of that. There is a huge amount of body of work about how to do this in architecture and urban design research work. And there are great books like Jane Jacobs from the Death and Life of Great American Cities, which is an excellent read. If you haven't read it, you should read it, especially if you're in build to rent. And there are people who have done a huge amount of research into how people use buildings and use spaces. And I think, this guy, William White, spent a whole lifetime studying this, and I think that sort of pretty much sums it up. As architects and designers, there's a whole myriad of features and designs and aspects of creating these neighbourhoods. And when we sit down as a team working out how we're going to create these communities and neighbourhoods with all the different myriad of features for creating a community, it can be overwhelming. And when you start to look at placemaking, as it's called, I don't prefer that terminology because I always believe a place already exists, and it's about understanding that place rather than making it. And then there's the health and well-being aspects that goes into the design of these places. And then you start analysing all this top-down stuff in terms of context, in terms of energy, in terms of, are there any existing heritage assets that you want to retain? Is the place safe? What's the crime issues? It's a whole myriad of aspects. But the most valuable thing from a designer's perspective is to actually sit and work with the local community, the local people who know their area very well, and actually use that as part of the design process. So that's neighbourhood engagement. And we believe, yes, the expert knowledge is important, but local knowledge is really the issue. Fortunately for Build to Rent, we have all this compressed into the ULI best practice guide. So I'm just going to draw out a couple of things from that I think really do help create these places. It's not all down to design, obviously. A lot of it, and we heard a bit earlier about operations, is fundamental. I'm not going to cover that. Getting the customer experiences is so important. But we can't force people to be friends. That's not our job in that sense, and it's certainly not very British, as we've been talking about. But I think it is really important that we create places that would facilitate social exchanges. We heard earlier Hannah talking about the dog. That's an operation issue, but the dog needs to sit somewhere and it needs a fireplace. That's the design issue. So that's why operations needs to come before design. There's a whole series of zones and areas, and I'm going to cover sort of probably 8 features of some of our work, and I'm going to show it through some of our work where we've incorporated various aspects. And of course, not all residents are the same, and this is really about understanding who your people will be. But it's not just about the residents. I think it's also about how people will actually operate and the people who will be using your buildings. Because if they're not happy, certainly they're not going to be able to encourage residents to enjoy the places that they're living. So it's fundamental. And I also think that things are changing. We've heard about the co-revolution, co-living, co-working. Things are changing. And I think that's an important aspect to understand. And our design standards have been very much in the past. They were designed for social housing, then private. No one sat down and worked out what it is for rent. But getting that mix right is really important. And certainly we advocate that, you may have a whole range of apartments and the one-bedrooms, but don't do them all the same because everyone has different budgets and different requirements, whether it's downsizers or people aspiring. So the sort of small, medium and large, yes, maybe the small ones are smaller than the design standards. I would argue as long as your average apartment sizes are on design standards, then that's a very good approach. But make sure you're doing it from an ergonomic design, not just space standards, and certainly not minimum space standards. And of course, mixing that up in terms of affordability is part of that. This is our project in Creekside, which is now on site. Our friends from HTA are helping us as well. And this has got a truly mixed use. It's not only got, you can see those different colours there. That talks not only just about the different apartment types, but also the discount market, so different incomes. So people all living together on different incomes, different stages of their life. And the building to the bottom there is all designed for families, so specifically focusing at families, which was brought up this morning. And then putting that in an environment that encourages interaction with other residents. The family building here has family amenities, and the apartments are designed thinking about children sleeping late at night, putting small bedrooms away from reception rooms, subtleties, buggies, large balconies, and so forth. But it is really important to not forget, obviously, that the public realm and the facilities in it, and especially in this case, creche facilities as well. So also providing local amenities in the local neighbourhood is just as important as for the residents, in our view. This is a project we're doing with Legal & General in Walthamstow, now Black Horse Mills, where all the development comes together in the space that's called a forum. It's designed to bring the residents together. But it's not just for the residents. During opening hours, which is apart from the middle of the night, it will be open to the public to walk through and experience the space. So there could be lots of community events happening through there at the same time. And that's been very much part of the scheme. And then clustering around that, other commercial opportunities, co-working, grocery stores. There's even going to be a microbrewery. Resident lobbies then give you access to more resident-orientated facilities. So in this case, there's an upper deck here with all those facilities that you would expect, and I'm not going to cover those now. And that's then all set up in publicly accessible landscape. So it's not just for residents, it's not a gated community, it's completely open and engaged with it. But there are private resident facilities, dining, exercises, studios, club rooms, there's even sundowners to watch the sunset over the reservoir. And this scheme is now on site as well. But there's also another aspect that I wanted to cover, which is this shift of emphasis. It's focusing on shared amenities. And in a more rural and suburban context, it's not always thinking about private gardens, it's having shared gardens. In buildings, it's about that shift of emphasis. It's not always about the private balconies, it's about the amenities and amenities at the top of the building, which I'll come to. And this is a scheme we're doing, we got planning for recently in Bromley by Bow, where we're clustering all those amenities around the new public space. And getting a scale of space and light transferring through it and thinking about how that works, but next to the public realm. So it's very visible. It's clearly also a good marketing strategy as well. Okay. And on larger schemes, we have rooftops with other amenities. And I think it's important to make sure that you do cluster these amenities in that sense. And that's why linking up circulation cores. The top one would be for sale, the bottom one would be build to rent. Main message here is to bring all the residents together so you have those incidences. Here, the yellow area here is not only the central amenities, but it also provides access to the garden spaces, and that brings and clusters all the residents together. And there's sorts of features as well as here in terms of workspace that relates to the public realm. This is in Manchester. And integrating with the public realm. Here's a scheme in Bristol where we have 2 blocks and we're bringing either side of a single street. And so that we can actually use that public space to help nurture that aspect of the scheme. And the other aspect, of course, is designing corridors are not just about access to the apartment. There are opportunities and instances for people to meet. So it's important to make sure there's good daylight, they are good proportions, and that they're located in a place where people will see other amenities. This is our project in Pontoon Dock, which is on GLA site, which is also on site at the moment. But it also provides a new access to the park, Thames Barrier Park. So the other aspect to this, and it was touched on this morning, about bringing forward housing early in the process, creating these communities faster. This is a project in Hungate in York, which we got planning for last week, which is 200 apartments that have been brought ahead of the programme and actually creating that community much sooner than would have otherwise have been. Has a rooftop terrace, it's very modest in its amenities. And then the final thing that I really wanted to cover, which was also covered this morning in terms of intergenerational living. This idea of build to rent has very similar attitudes in some ways, as we heard this morning, with later living. And this idea of bringing student living and later living and build to rent together, perhaps managed by one organisation, you could not ask for a more sustainable and more vibrant community if you could pull that off. And I would encourage a lot of people to start to think about how that could work. And that pretty much should create those distinctive residential communities that I think we're all looking for. Thank you.
Well done. The good news for Alex is that it was more than 10 minutes. But I think actually really good news for us, because you covered an immense amount of information, and that was always going to be the challenge today with such a strong panel. To keep to time was always going to be difficult. Okay, so I think that's a really good introduction to what we're talking about today, creating new neighbourhoods and communities. I'm just going to kick off by asking each of you the same question, to just define what neighbourhoods and communities means to you and the relevance to your organisations. And Alex, I'm going to start with you.
Okay, so I think as my colleague Rebecca said this morning, places for people, we try to kind of do what it says on the tin. One of my greatest frustrations about coming into the property industry was the inherent siloed nature of the way that we approach any kind of development. You know, I build offices between 8 and 12 stories in these locations. I build social housing in kind of corners of, cheap land over here. When actually the places that we all want to live, if we have the choice, are those kind of integrated mixed tenure communities. And they tend to be the ones that work best, that have access to amenities, access to employment and transportation. So what Places for People really pioneered 20 years ago when they were getting grant from government to build housing for poor people, often in poor locations, was to say, actually, no, we're not going to do it there. We're going to build slightly less of the social in total, but actually we're going to build social housing and market rent housing and housing for sale, and we're going to do it in better locations, and we're going to make that place work better, because actually that creates a better community. And that's something I'm really proud of as an organisation that we've really pioneered. It's great that placemaking has moved from being an urbanist buzzword into being a thing that is increasingly considered normal, but mixed-use development is still more difficult because of a range of factors, and I think that's something that we should all be striving for.
Good. And Olivia?
So I think to us, community is, first of all, within the building. We're providing someone with a safe space to live, but also an opportunity to meet their neighbours if they so wish. We saw the video earlier. Some people want to, some people don't want to, and it's about enabling that rather than forcing that on people. We'll also work with our residents to set up tenants associations, again, if they wish. Actually, what we find in a lot of our build-to-rent buildings, particularly the smaller ones, is the residents themselves will club together and create a Facebook group, and that's how they communicate with each other. I think one of the things that's also really important, and it's often as a response to the feedback we get over planning applications, is our place in the wider community. Often response to a planning application is an objection by the local community, and what we'd like to see is how that can be changed so that we can show through our planning the benefits we're bringing to the wider community. And then I think finally for us, we're about supporting those that are working in London on modest incomes. So very much the location of where people are living, being a reasonable commute to their work is something that, again, is key to what we do.
Yeah. And Russell?
Well, just really to add to that, from a designer's perspective, I mean, I showed there just a project where we had brought this with the client, this idea of a forum, and bringing people together, but also bringing them with the local neighbourhood. And allowing them access to those facilities. Because what came out of that, and the reason that happened was because we had a lot of public consultation and engagement workshops. And most people have just said, well, there's nothing to do here. Why are you coming here? You know, there's no restaurants, there's nothing here. There's nowhere to drink, hence the brewery. And there was all of that. And so it wasn't just about, you know, I mean, yes, we could elevate the private residents and give them these great views of the lake. But actually, to make it really successful, it was creating this, if you like, this blank canvas for the local community to actually use those spaces. And I think certainly on scheme, you can't do it on the smaller schemes, I understand that. But on the large schemes, you should do it.
Yeah, yeah. And just then, Alex, coming back to you, so just, and also thinking about your ULI experience, you've done a lot of time thinking about this, you know, neighbourhoods, communities, how you create those. What do you think the intrinsic values are of these, of that greatness? You know, what is it? What are we trying to achieve? Or what are the values that we're trying to head towards, do you think?
I think, you know, it's this idea of community can be so subjective, but we're in an era where we've appointed a minister for loneliness in our government. And we're acknowledging that people are living longer and longer, and that, you know, there's this huge rise of, you know, terrible amount of mental health issues and suicides among students who are feeling too much pressure. There's people, you know, that the UK works the longest hours in Europe, and, you know, people are feeling burnout, and then, you know, older people are feeling isolated and miserable. I think that idea of community and knowing your neighbours. When I rented in the traditional private rented sector in London, I lived in the same apartment for 3 years, and I put notes under neighbours' doors, tried to meet them, and never once did. I moved back down to Bristol, to the West Country, and within 8 hours, I had met 6 of my neighbours because just inherently there was a community there that was a bit more engaging and wanted to have that. And that's one of the great reasons that's why I moved there, that it had that social side. Now, there is always the balance. You don't want the forced fun. The kind of Club 1830 idea is absolutely anathema to what most people want. But the option, exactly as friends from the collective said this morning, to have the opportunity when you're coming particularly to big cities that are really intimidating and scary coming from outside, and to be able to have the chance to maybe make a friend or just go for a coffee with or have a bike ride or have a chat and just not be isolated. The one story I can try and tell is a good friend of mine who works for a charity, and they, for cost reasons, closed their central London office and made everybody sort of individual work from home. She rents a flat in Streatham on her own. It's kind of a garden flat, and it's really lovely, and she's doing really well, but she has really struggled with it because she says, I can go days without speaking to a person in person, and it's horrible. And she's a bubbly, confident, outgoing person, but she said, I am so isolated. And that's what's available in the PRS in her price bracket. She would love to be in somewhere where she could be part of a community.
And we talk a lot about residents and the values that they might want, but do you think it's any different for investors? Because it seems to me there should be an alignment between happy residents, happy investor, because it's underwriting the success of your scheme. Do you think there's a difference?
Absolutely. I think I was on the verge of getting my pom-poms out and cheering the investor panel this morning because it's so wonderful to hear an investor panel talking about people, talking about not the assets on the spreadsheet, but about the homes and the people and the communities they're investing in. And I think what's really great about this sector is that most of the investment coming into it is enlightened enough to understand that connection, that it's not just about the asset value. It's about the premium is actually the community create, the happiness of that community will lead to a greater likelihood of renewals. It's one of the reasons that Neil Young, if he were here, I know he's poorly, so he's not been able to join us, but can talk about at Get Living London, that kind of positivity that you create generates a better return.
Yeah, absolutely. And just then, Russell, perhaps in terms of how do we measure the value and success of creating community? So we've talked about that it's a good thing, but I imagine that when you're advising clients, you perhaps have to potentially, some of them, educate them a bit as to the value in this, the benefits of it.
Less so, to be honest, the clients, more so the planners.
Okay.
That's an issue, but it's breaking down a lot. For us, we've just started a program of sort of which we plan to roll out a lot, post-occupancy review of our schemes. So we'll be feeding that into and I'm just thinking right now, how are we going to measure, a successful community, and all those sort of things. But certainly, a lot of our clients that we're working with generally understand. And I've noticed, I've been coming to this event for the last 3 or 4 years now, and I really enjoy this event. And what is great here today is to hear all the kind of questions. I mean, no longer, well, there was one question about use class. We always had that in the early, the whole conference debated that on the day one. But now we're talking about people and communities and how we can build things faster with modular and all those things. So, it's creating these communities that are different and can actually kickstart some of these areas where housing is clearly needed.
Yeah. And Olivia, from your experience, what are residents' priorities from a neighbourhood perspective? What do they? You've talked about the force fund or not ensuring or not giving force fund, but what do you think their priorities for neighbourhoods are?
I think people like the choice, like you said, of not force fund. They can meet their neighbours if they want. And Russ and I were talking about a building we've got earlier, which is built around an internal courtyard, and what that will enable people is to have those natural meetings with their residents where they bump into them and then they bump into them the next day, so that you gradually create that sense of community. Alongside everybody else, we also obviously provide communal space, and it's about making sure that communal space works for all the different types of people that you've got in your building, whether they just want to go and sit in the roof garden and read a book or have children up there as well.
That is a very successful scheme because it focuses it, and that was the point I was trying to make earlier, is that a lot of schemes, there's a temptation to spread all this amenity out, and that's definitely the wrong solution. Maybe on larger schemes, yes, but you really focus it. In fact, you want it to be so popular that the next thing you're going to do, and the next refurb, is to actually enlarge that space because it is so. That's probably the best way of approaching it.
Yeah.
And I think on that building particularly, and you talked about corridors earlier, safety is a big thing with lots of people living on their own. Knowing that they can safely get to their front door and they can safely come out of their front door is quite important. And so the access to the building as well, making sure that is a safe communal space.
And go on, Alex.
One quick thing on the kind of what residents want panel. I loved that earlier this morning, and it's so great to see the kind of evolution of that conversation. But I did some work in the US, particularly on the later living end, and one of the challenges is that we don't always know what we want. You can get into that known knowns and unknown knowns. There's an awful lot of research, particularly in the US later living market, that shows that the top 10 things that people want before they move into a retirement community are very different to what they want when they've been there for 6 months or a year. And I think before I worked for PFP, I worked as a consultant for a large landowner in London who had a scheme where they were trying to do a relatively small kind of public realm improvement that the local residents desperately didn't want and campaigned against and they really tried to prevent, and then when it eventually happened, they all loved it and said, why didn't you do it earlier? And I think one of the challenges is sometimes it's hugely important to engage and listen to the existing community, but also with this product, people aren't familiar enough to know what it is we're offering. When the current core rental offer is often so poor, it's almost impossible to imagine that you could have a better experience as a renter and all these extra things included. So they might not know that that's even possible. I think that's tricky.
Absolutely.
And we're the ones with with the tenants, so we're the ones with the opportunity to discover that. So a customer satisfaction survey, for example, shouldn't just be about customer satisfaction, it should be about taking their ideas so that we can continue to learn from our customers.
And sticking with you then and Dolphin's experience, so I think in the media there feels like there's an awful lot of focus on the very high end, 5-star, glass towers, city centre locations, but Dolphin are doing something different. So you're totally focused on affordable discount market.
Yeah.
So, and how do you balance what some people may consider as sort of the more expensive items with your particular model?
So we don't provide gyms and concierges because that would really prevent us from providing more homes at affordable rents. And the priority to our tenants, often who have either sofa surfed or lived in shared accommodation or remained with their parents far longer than they would have liked to, is about providing them, their priority is with a safe, well-insulated home of their own where they control their tenancy. And I guess that's the sort of first thing. And in order to do that for as many people as possible and try and keep our rents down, we don't provide the additional amenities. The other thing that we have looked at as an organisation and has come with some interesting responses is within a community, given people different rents depending on their household composition and their earnings. And they all know that they're paying different rents, but because they understand that this is fair, it hasn't upset the community by doing that. And that in itself enables us to bring in more homes as affordable rent as opposed to market rent.
And I think, so it's interesting, isn't it? Sort of that understanding and engagement with the products then ties into wellbeing, which also has part of this neighbourhood building, doesn't it? How important do you think that wellbeing is to your residents? That feeling of wellbeing or sense of sort of promoting wellbeing?
Yeah, I think it's a sense of being listened to. What people were talking about earlier is often rental is seen as not having a choice. And so us being a landlord that go and listen to our tenants and give them the opportunity to engage with them is something that's really, really important to them. And then it makes rental seem like a choice rather that they're making rather than something that's been forced upon them.
Yeah. Okay. So, Alex, within PFP, what work are you doing to deliver better places to live, more vibrant communities, sort of practicing what you preach, I guess?
So Places for People has a huge amount of large-scale regeneration and placemaking work. So my colleague Mary Parsons, whom you will know, is leading work on schemes as diverse as 1,500 homes on Eastwick and Sweetwater around the Olympic Park, 500 PRS, 500 affordable and 500 for sale, plus a library and all sorts of other great stuff there. We've got a scheme in the northeast in JV with Urban Splash that's using some great modular construction and is a great mix. We have Gilston in Surrey, many of you may have seen, it's 10,000 homes across 3 villages. So we have, the amount of community creation in that is absolutely huge. So we're doing that a lot with a kind of PRS and build to rent hats on specifically. We've got some work evolving through our PFP Capital fund management business, which is really exciting. And you can watch this space for more announcements about that. But I think it's identifying that this particular tenure has opportunities to accelerate that community building, that kind of estate regeneration point that Russell made. That fundamentally on a scheme I can sell 3 units a week, but I can probably rent 8 to 10. And those people in a build-to-rent scheme, they will be there, they will be occupied. They won't be buy-to-let landlords where some of them may be empty or they're investors where they're not there. These are actually people who will form part of that community. And I think that understanding that build-to-rent can really help generate communities in the longer term is really, really important.
And I think this idea of using build-to-rent as part of bigger scale developments, it's something that we're very keen on within Homes England, about actually accelerating and getting placemaking. You're not the pioneers in the first 100 sale units. Actually, there's something going on. But what do we have to do to build that community in what could be a bit like Russell was touching on, you're in a place of a sort of blank canvas, basically. What do you think the key items are to think about?
And I think one of my least favourite places in the world is Dubai, in that sense, where they've just chucked up a huge amount of towers, but with no kind of roads that just peter out and don't go anywhere, and there's no actual infrastructure. I mean, the heat makes things difficult, but the very basic things of a park or a bit of public realm or a bit of space like that you can activate straight away. One of my favourite schemes in the US that we went to on the first study tour with ULI that Russell came to was very kind of basic low-rise, 3-storey, would not have looked out of place in kind of rural UK suburban, 1 hour outside DC, and it didn't have bells and whistles amenity. It had a little kind of office with a sort of post room, but the main amenity was a small playground in the middle. And it was a kind of mid-market and affordable mixed product. And it was fantastic. It had won awards and it had the consistently best rated, really happy community. And its amenity was just that outdoor space, but it allowed families a safe space for their children to play, a place where they could integrate and mix and mingle and have a chat. And that's kind of all you need to get a place going, a safe space that you can enjoy as a community. And Olivia.
Yeah, well, for us, actually, one of our main focuses is about this reasonable commute into work, because we're supporting people that are working in London. And so we're looking, we will not go into areas where we don't think the commuting is supportable or it's too long, because actually if you add the cost of the commute on, you can quite often, the discount you're giving on the rent becomes irrelevant, because people are spending so much commuting and so much time, particularly where people are doing hourly work, because they might, paid by the hour. And so, that again limits. And the 24-hour tube is therefore great for some of our residents.
Absolutely. And Alex, you touched on the States there, or your time in America. So, and you did spend a bit of time there with ULI. Are there other things, do you think, that you particularly took, or that ULI took from America in lessons learned? We kind of hold them up as the example.
I think there's always been this tendency to have this kind of slavish copy. And as you rightly pointed out, when build to rent started to emerge in the UK, the easy place to focus was kind of tall towers, very high-end, lots of amenities, bells and whistles. Actually, if you talk to lots of people in the US multifamily market, they talk a lot about the amenities arms race and how that's a real problem and that you need to avoid that kind of getting too competitive about that. I think some of the some locations in the US are able to pioneer the individualized rent or the sort of tenure blind mix that Olivia runs at Dolphin, and that's really, really positive. But also, 70% of the US multifamily market is actually sort of suburban, lower-rise, garden-style kind of housing. It's not all the big, shiny, very, very high. There's absolutely a place for that. And I think one of the things that we perhaps do need to learn in the UK is that build-to-rent is not one typology of building. It's not one type of tenant, young millennials, as we discussed earlier. It's actually a whole range, and that it doesn't need to work on its own. It needs to work alongside for sale housing and alongside traditional social housing, and to be part of just the wider mix. It's just got to be good mixed use.
It's part of the patchwork, isn't it? And I thought actually some of the discussion earlier about older living, because we all talk about the millennials, a very bespoke or very specific area of need, but actually it has need all the way through, and communities is a big part of that, isn't it?
We're doing quite a bit of work on how those different very innovative communities, the later living community and the build to rent, perhaps millennial, the co-working, we're looking at how we could work so that they could all work together and come together in the public realm, whether it's on a urban situation or whether it's in a garden style situation, similar to the scheme that Alex was referring to. This idea of bringing people together. I mean, if you read all the body of volume of research and work, it says you've got to mix this up, because otherwise you're going to ghetto whatever it is.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it's just fundamental, and for an investor, I think that's must reduce the risk.
Yeah, and just touching there on your clients, and you mentioned earlier that actually they are more knowledgeable, but are you finding that they are quite enlightened now, that they're coming to you with quite a clear plan, or is it still...
No, I mean, it's, I think that they have, I mean, often we're part of the journey with them in terms of understanding, I don't want to talk about branding and all of that, but of course that comes into the conversation. Who are they? One of our clients was very specific, because I want to design this building so that it will suit what the average Londoner earns, and every decision that we make has got to relate to that, because at the end of the day, it's got to deliver that. And it does force you to think very differently. Conversations, no doubt, you've had. You do make big decisions, but you've actually got that scheme, which I was referring to earlier, with this fantastic atrium that brings people together. It hasn't got all the bells and whistles, but some thought's gone into it. And so there are all sorts of ways of doing it. It's not all about club dining rooms and that.
Swimming pools on the roof.
Yeah.
Absolutely. But you touched also on local authorities, and how do we start sharing?
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of them, certainly the GLA is starting to understand that. There's no question. But in since we're here in London, the London boroughs, some of them, not all of them, still struggle with the concept. And I could talk all night about our planning and design standards that are still set in the dark ages, and they need to be completely upgraded to different ways people want to live now. And there's that friction between the two. I'm sure we heard it this morning. I didn't hear the co-living collective session, but I'm sure they struggle with many authorities with their idea of what residential is, because it's completely different to the housing targets that many local authorities have to meet.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I think that's probably enough questioning for me for now. I think we can open up to the floor. Did anyone have a question that they wanted to ask? Andrew. There's a mic coming.
Thanks. Andrew Screen, Residential Capital Management now. I wanted to know what is the kind of critical mass, in other words, the number of units you need before you can create that kind of neighborhood community? And the second one is, does it differ as well if you have a difference of tenures and mixed use? In other words, if you've got built to rent, later living, for sale units, can you create the same community, or those communities sort of distinct in a sort of separate way?
Russell, do you want to pick that one up initially?
I mean, when I was talking about mixing up, it was all very much on the rental model. It wasn't about for sale, and there are issues of mixing those as well. But certainly, some of those schemes I showed you, just to give you an example of the sort of 400 to 500 unit schemes, they have lots of ground floor amenities and also rooftop amenities. You know, they've got a whole variety of things. But the guide, the ULI guide, actually talks about primary amenities and secondary amenities. And it's the primary ones that, frankly, I think every scheme needs to have. And it's what you need to live. You know, the refuse needs to be cleared away, and you need secure, safe places to be. You need a certain amount of postal facilities and all those parcel deliveries. All those things are what we refer to as primary. But then there is the secondary. And we know from the work that we've been doing that those secondary facilities, other than just a single club lounge, don't really start to kick in unless the scheme is over 200 units. Yeah. Now, whether that's right or not, I don't know. But certainly I can only talk from our experience working with a whole range of clients. That's what seems to happen.
Alex, go on, Olivia.
We've got a scheme of 16 units in London, and it's got a communal garden at the back, and then, as you would assume, refuse, bike stores, and they have created their own community. And the residents know each other, and they like each other, and they communicate amongst themselves, and often, we know from our communications with them that they have this interaction between them. So I don't think there's, with a scheme with these primary facilities, it still can create community, even if it's quite small.
Yeah.
And I guess there's a bit around meeting your provisions to the scale of your scheme. So like you say, for 16 units, a garden space that perhaps can be shared and enjoyed, whereas somewhere like a lounge for 16 units probably isn't going to work so well. So it's kind of meeting, isn't it, meeting your need depending on your scheme.
And often, because even in larger schemes, you've got separate cores where, you've got maximum 7-8 units off that core. That's what in itself creates the community. Those are the people that people will know, because they're the people they see on a daily basis, rather than seeing people who lives right across the other side of the development.
Yeah, I agree with that to a point, but actually that's one of the standards that I think really affects the rental side, because I don't think that's the idea of 7 or 8 apartments per floor per core was derived really from the affordable housing, social housing. It was a management issue, and now it's migrated into private rental and now into the schemes that are coming out now. But actually, if you get the design right, there is nothing wrong having 15, 20 apartments per core. Yes, obviously you've got to have escape stairs and all of that, but you actually want to bring people together. And when you do, you've got to do it really well with natural daylight, dwell area, whilst you're waiting for the lift, look out, down on the amenities, see your neighbours down there, pop down, say hello, that sort of thing. If you design it that way, I have no problem, and we've demonstrated that you can create some really nice places. So that's a classic example, in my view, where design standards are really stifling creativity.
And there's a really key, I mean, it's a sad illustration of that, but it's one that I use all the time when I'm in meetings with investors who are struggling to get why they should have even the primary amenity. There was an HMO in Bristol, where I live, that had, the landlord had entirely legitimately converted the lounge area into another bedroom in order to drive small rent. There were 9 people in it from a range of kind of nationalities, all working long jobs in different shifts. And a very, very small kitchen, and nowhere for them to congregate or mix. So they didn't really, they had to take shifts to kind of make their food because they couldn't really mix. One of the young men had a heart attack in his bedroom, and it took 2 weeks, basically, until the body began to smell, for them to realise. One of them, they didn't know which shift pattern he was on. They thought he was out. Because they hadn't had time to really form any bonds beyond a sort of nod in the corridor, because there was no space for them to mingle. That could have been a community. An HMO of 9 people can be a community if there is a space for them to get to know each other, and there wasn't. And it is shameful that we are asking people who are in work and working hard and contributing to our society, and they're having to live in essentially rabbit hutches where they don't have any of that basic space just to be able to say, hi, I'm new here, you live here too, maybe let's eat our food together. So that for me is a really important, it absolutely could have been a community if they'd had a bit of a space, and that house has now been refurbished with a kind of a room that can be a mixing area. But that is a terrible illustration of how important this is.
And I think it's also an illustration of how important well-being, actually that communities are really important. People, we're not individual, as a sort of entity, we're not individual. We like to congregate, like to get together. Another question? Oh, over here. Thank you.
Hello, Matthew Lesniak. I'm working for The Collective, and I recently worked as a community facilitator on site, so trying to strengthen the community experience on site, which has a lot to do with well-being and happiness and all different kinds of aspects of the experience there. And currently I'm helping build with 2 other individuals social impact, or an impact team for The Collective. So we're looking in how to kind of measure and analyze the social and ecological impact of the old oak and future spaces afterwards as well. So I would love to speak with each of you about kind of your models for social impact measurements, and if there are any benchmarks or anything for that as well. And then do these kinds of, like, when you start to measure these this social and ecological impacts, do you find that it attracts new customers and investors, like accessing new markets, accessing new talent, new customers, impact investments, 3D investments, things like this?
Alex?
So within Places for People, so social impact and value is crucial to us. We have 2 people who work full-time, well, more than 2, actually 5. We have a small charity, which is one of the businesses within our group that focuses on delivering that impact. From an investor perspective, there are some tools, I can tell you about them later. There's lots of stuff out there. From an investor perspective, and I'm sure some of you will have seen that the CEO of BlackRock recently issued a letter which emphasised the need for investors to look much more seriously at their social value that they were creating, particularly through real estate. Anyone who's worked in fund management will be familiar with ESG, environmental, social and governance. And for a long time, that was essentially a kind of CSR, was the predecessor, would have been a donation to a charity, or maybe like a day's staff volunteer time. It's taken much, much more seriously now. So the environmental impacts, GRESB and various benchmarks are more than just tick box exercises. People are really checking air quality, they're checking the kind of the well-being of the environment. But on the social side, I think investors are increasingly concerned, and rightly, that the things that they're investing in need to generate social value. They need not to be gated sort of communities or ghettos. And I think that's about time. One of the biggest frustrations I have is when I'm talking at sort of supplier conferences, is the number of people who will come to me and say that they have a product that would work for a social spec. Well, anything that we build, I want to be of the same quality. I might fit it out slightly different or offer different amenities, but the core build has to absolutely be the same quality. And I think we are still so focused about those kind of individual silos. That's a real problem that the industry needs to get over. But I think we're on the right track.
I think we've maybe got time for one more quick question, if there are any more.
A question for Alex and I guess whoever else, but going back to what we were actually talking about in the what renters want panel about build to rent, people don't know what they don't know. So you can ask people beforehand, but if they don't know it exists, they can't give you the answer. So Alex, what would you suggest we do as an industry? Do you have any nuggets that we could do to actually start this education process and really firmly position build to rent in a consumer-facing way?
So as lots of seen, there's a big sort of Twitter discussion going on around, the terminology clearly is wrong, but the reason that lots of us coalesced around build to rent in 2012, 2013 was because we were trying to differentiate it from the wider PRS. Build to rent is a component part of that wider sector, and it is a different product, designed differently, operated differently, and kind of invested differently. It's absolutely not a consumer-friendly or consumer-facing term, and I think that will evolve by experience. There's a kind of, the more schemes that we get up and running, the more people who have lived in something at Get Living, or have lived in the Dolphin apartment and progressed on, or have lived in Quintain and Wembley and the other ones around the UK, the more there will be this understanding that I can expect something more. I think you can see that from the student sector. The student housing that I lived in decades ago is absolutely not what most students today will tolerate. And people who are graduating will expect something better. There is a price point issue as well that you need to understand that this can be a very broad sector, but I think, I have no idea what we'll end up calling it. I don't think multifamily will work in the UK, but I think the lessons will come through people who've experienced and know that something better is out there.
Olivia, do you know?
So, yeah, I think for us as an organisation, we're relatively new. Our first property completed in 2013, and our focus has been about growth and looking at the level of rents that we're able to provide, really trying to provide as many sub-market rental homes as we can for as low as possible rent. And now we have a tenant base. The next thing that we're doing is we're going and asking those tenants that live in our homes, what is their view on our homes, what is it they want, and they are our most valuable resource for that.
Okay, so I think I probably need to close up there. Thank you all so much for joining me. Hopefully everyone enjoyed it. I think what's the really exciting thing about this is it's still very new, isn't it? It's very nascent, but we're learning so fast that actually the pace of it should get just more exciting more quickly as we go along. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.